Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. I came home, expecting a normal evening, but what I found was a nightmare. On the kitchen counter, a note, a simple goodbye. I'm sorry, but I've left. We're starting a new life. It was from my husband and, to my horror, from the nanny too. I stood frozen, unable to process the words. My heart pounded in my chest. How could this happen? How could they just vanish like this, without a trace, leaving me in the ruins of what was supposed to be our life? I immediately grabbed my phone and dialed his number. It rang, and then voicemail. I tried again and again, but still nothing. A sick feeling washed over me. The silence felt louder than any words he could have said. How could he do this? Take everything we built, everything I believed in, and throw it away? My thoughts raced. I went to the living room, searching for clues. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they hadn't really left. But no, everything was gone. I stumbled around the house in disbelief. I kept thinking this was all just a terrible misunderstanding, but the evidence was everywhere. I looked through our shared belongings, through our life, and it hit me like a punch in the gut. He was really gone. Not only him, but our child too. The note was clear. He had taken our son with him and left me behind. I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face. How could someone who promised to love me forever do this? My mind raced. Was this a midlife crisis? Was he unhappy? Had I missed all the signs? Our life together had been filled with love, or so I thought. How long had he been planning this? How long had the nanny been involved? She was supposed to be helping with the kids, not running off with my husband. I dialed her number, desperate for answers. But just like him, she didn't answer. Was I being punished for something I didn't even know I'd done? I grabbed the house keys and rushed outside, as if somehow the world might make sense again if I just went to look for him. I drove aimlessly, my mind too clouded to think clearly. I needed to find him. I needed to confront him. But where could he have gone? There were no signs, no hints. The car was gone. His personal belongings, gone. I had no idea where to even start looking. I dialed the nanny's number again, but again, no answer. Where were they? Why was I being kept in the dark? My thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and anger. What had gone wrong? Was I so blinded by love that I failed to see the cracks forming? Every possible scenario ran through my head, each one worse than the last. I called his friends, his family, but they knew nothing. They all thought it was some sort of joke. But this wasn't funny. It wasn't a joke. I was being left alone with no explanation, and I had to make sense of it all on my own. The pain was unbearable. The silence in the house was deafening. I kept thinking, maybe it's all a bad dream. Maybe I'll wake up and he'll be here, laughing at me for overreacting. But this wasn't a dream. I wasn't waking up from anything. This was real. My husband, the man I had spent my life with, was gone. He had taken my child, the one thing I could never live without. The emptiness in my chest was like a physical pain, and no matter what I did, I couldn't make it go away. The days passed in a blur. I didn't know what to do with myself. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the note. I saw him walking out the door with our son. The house, once a place of love and laughter, now felt cold and hollow. The walls seemed to close in on me. I tried calling again, texting, even emailing, but I got no response. It was as if they had disappeared off the face of the earth. Where were they? How could they be so cruel? The next step was clear. I couldn't just sit around and wait anymore. I called a private investigator. Maybe they could track him down. Maybe they could find them, figure out where they had gone. I needed to know. I couldn't live like this, in a constant state of uncertainty. The PI promised to do what they could, but I couldn't help feeling like I was grasping at straws. Was this really my life now? Chasing down the man who had promised to love me forever, only to find he had betrayed me? The investigator got back to me with a lead. He had tracked them to a small town a few hours away. They had rented a cabin, but it was only a temporary stop. I had to act fast. I packed a bag, got in the car, and drove like a woman possessed. My mind was spinning with questions, but I couldn't let myself be consumed by doubt. I had to find him, and I had to get my son back. I couldn't think of anything else. Nothing else mattered. This was my only focus. I arrived at the cabin, my heart hammering in my chest. I knocked on the door, my hands shaking. No one answered. The windows were dark, and the yard was empty. Was I too late? Had they left again? My stomach twisted with fear. What if they had already gone? I couldn't imagine the pain of having missed them, of having come so close only to find out they were gone again. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. This had to be them. They had to be here. Just as I was about to give up, I saw her. The nanny. She was standing in the window, looking out at me. She didn't seem surprised to see me. Why wasn't she? Why didn't she look guilty, ashamed? She opened the door slowly, her face unreadable. I was ready to scream at her, to demand answers, but somehow, the words got stuck in my throat. I had so many questions, so much anger, but she stood there quietly, almost waiting for me to speak first. The moment she opened her mouth, I knew something was wrong. I had no choice, she said softly, her voice cracking. He asked me to leave with him. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could she have agreed to this? She was supposed to be someone I trusted, someone I invited into my home. Yet here she was, standing in front of me, explaining how she had helped my husband steal my child. I felt the anger bubble up inside me, but I stayed quiet. I needed more than just her words. Why did you do this? I demanded. Why him? Why my family? I could feel my voice shaking with emotion, but I couldn't stop. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was about the life we built together. Why take my son? Why not just leave me alone? Her face softened, and she took a deep breath. He wasn't happy, she said, barely above a whisper. He said you didn't understand him anymore. I didn't know what to do. He told me he needed me. The room seemed to close in on me as I processed her words. My husband had been unhappy? He had never said anything. He had never once hinted at any of this. All this time, I had thought we were fine, that we were strong. But apparently, all of that was a lie. He didn't just leave because he was unhappy. He left because he had found someone else. Someone who was willing to follow him, no questions asked. I felt the ground shift beneath me. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about everything I thought I knew falling apart. Unhappy? I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. That's it? You're telling me he left because he was unhappy? She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with regret. He said you didn't care anymore, that you were too focused on everything else. I couldn't believe it. I had always supported him, always tried to be there. But was I really that blind? Had I really missed the signs? How could I have been so naive? And what about our son? How could he just take him without a second thought? I felt the tears threatening to spill over, but I held them back. I wasn't going to cry in front of her. Not after everything she had done. You took him, I said, my voice steady, but cold. You left with my son. You let him believe this was okay. The nanny's face crumpled. I didn't want to, she whispered, but he made it sound like we were meant to be together, that we were meant to have this life. I shook my head in disbelief. She was as lost in this fantasy as he was. This wasn't real. This wasn't love. I just don't understand, I said, my voice barely audible. How could you do this? To me? To our family? She took a step back, as though she couldn't bear to see the pain in my eyes. I never meant to hurt you, she said softly. I never wanted any of this. I couldn't stop the anger that surged through me. But you did. You hurt me. You took my husband. You took my child. And now you're telling me it was a mistake? The betrayal felt like a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. I want him back, I said, my voice low but fierce. I want my son back. The nanny nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'll help you find him, she promised. But it's not that simple. I didn't care how complicated it was. I wasn't going to give up on my son. I would do whatever it took to bring him home. She gave me the address where they were staying, but I had no idea what I would find when I got there. Would he be there? Would he even want to come home? I drove to the address she gave me, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what to expect. Would my son even recognize me? Would he want to leave with me? The thought of him growing up in that new life with them made my stomach churn. But there was no turning back. I had to do this. I had to get him back. When I arrived, I hesitated for a moment, but then I knocked. I heard footsteps from inside. My heart stopped. Would he be there? The door creaked open, and there he was, my husband. His face was gaunt, as if the last few weeks had drained him. Behind him, our son stood, clutching a toy in his small hands, looking up at me with wide, confused eyes. My heart shattered seeing them together. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. I need to talk to you, I said, my voice trembling. He didn't speak at first. His eyes avoided mine, guilt hanging in the air like a thick fog. This wasn't the reunion I had imagined. I didn't think you would come, he finally said, his voice low and resigned. I thought you'd be better off without me. My chest tightened. How could he say that? After everything we shared, after all we had been through, he thought I would just move on? You left without a word, I said, my voice cracking with emotion. You took our son and disappeared, without even telling me why. He looked away, his jaw tightening. I didn't know how to explain. I didn't want to hurt you. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I held back. How could you do this to us? I asked quietly, trying to hold on to my composure. How could you walk away from everything? He ran a hand through his hair, looking exhausted. I was lost. I didn't know who I was anymore. His words were vague, almost as if he were trying to justify this madness. And what about our son? I asked, my heart aching as I turned to him. Our boy stood there, clutching his toy, his innocent eyes flickering between the two of us. He didn't deserve this, I whispered. None of us did. I thought I could find myself again, he continued, his voice hollow. I thought I needed a new start, somewhere far away. I could hardly breathe, the weight of his words crashing over me. And you thought running away with her was the answer? I didn't mean to say it, but it came out anyway, sharp and accusatory. He winced. It wasn't like that, he said, but his tone betrayed him. I could see the guilt in his eyes. He had made a choice, and it wasn't just for him. It was for them, him and the nanny. The silence between us felt suffocating. I wanted to scream, to shout, to make him understand how much he had hurt me, how much he had torn our family apart. But I stayed quiet, letting his words hang in the air. I never wanted to hurt you, he repeated, almost like a mantra, but it didn't make it any better. He had already done the damage. You already did, I said softly. You left. You took my son. You shattered everything we built. He lowered his eyes, as if the weight of my words had struck him in the chest. I turned to our son, who had been watching us with wide, innocent eyes. My heart broke. He was so young, too young to understand what was happening, too young to understand why his father had chosen this. I knelt down to his level, my voice gentle as I called his name. Hey, sweetie, I said, my hands trembling as I reached for him. He took a small step back, unsure of me. Mommy's here now, I whispered, my heart breaking all over again. I wanted to pull him into my arms, but he wasn't ready. I don't know what to say, my husband finally admitted, his voice cracking. I didn't plan for any of this, but his words felt empty to me. They were just excuses now. He couldn't take back what he had done. You don't have to say anything, I said quietly. Just let me take him home. I reached for my son again, my heart in my throat, but he hesitated. He looked at his father, then at me, torn between us. The pain of seeing him caught in the middle was unbearable. The nanny stood in the background, watching silently. She hadn't said a word since I arrived. I looked at her, my anger bubbling up again. And you? I said, my voice cold. You're just going to stand there? She flinched, her eyes lowering. I never meant for any of this to happen, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But you knew what you were doing, I replied sharply. You betrayed me. You betrayed our family. She didn't argue, but I could see the guilt written all over her face. Why now? I asked my husband, my voice shaky with emotion. Why not before? Why wait until everything was destroyed? He didn't answer right away. He stared at the ground, as though he couldn't face me. Finally, he spoke. I thought maybe this would fix things, he said. I thought maybe I needed someone who could make me feel alive again. I felt the rage bubbling up inside me. You had a family. You had me. I almost shouted, but my voice cracked, and I took a deep breath, trying to control it. I stood up, my hands clenched at my sides, trying to make sense of everything. You didn't fix anything, I said softly. You just ruined everything. His face twisted in pain, but I wasn't sure if it was for me or for himself. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said again. But this time, the words felt hollow. I had heard them too many times already. You can't take this back, I whispered. You can't undo what you've done. The tears finally came, but I didn't try to hold them back. I was done pretending. Our son, still standing by the door, looked up at me with questioning eyes. Mommy? He asked quietly. I couldn't stop the tears now. I rushed to him, scooping him up into my arms. I'm here, baby. I'm here, I whispered, holding him close. He clung to me, his small hands gripping my shirt, his face pressed against my shoulder. The relief of having him in my arms again was overwhelming, but the pain of seeing how much he had been torn between us made my heart ache. I'm sorry, my husband said, his voice cracking. I looked at him, shaking my head. Sorry isn't enough. He looked defeated, but I didn't care anymore. I had spent so much time waiting for him to come to his senses, to apologize, but now it felt like it was too late. He had made his choices, and those choices had consequences. I don't know what's going to happen now, he said quietly. I never expected it to go this far. It didn't matter. What mattered was my son. He was the only thing that mattered now. I stood in that cabin, holding my son, and realized something I hadn't let myself see before. My life wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me. I had to rebuild, to find myself again. I'm taking him home, I said firmly, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. We'll figure this out. But it's going to be without you. He nodded silently, accepting what was happening. I looked at him one last time, but I didn't feel anger anymore. Just sadness. For what we could have been, for what we lost. I walked out of the cabin, my son in my arms, and never looked back. I didn't need to. The life I had with him was gone, and now it was time for me to move on. But as I drove away, a part of me couldn't help but feel like I was leaving behind something I could never get back. Maybe it wasn't just him I was leaving. Maybe it was the dream of what we could have been, a dream that had crumbled in front of me. But there was no room for regret anymore. The drive back home was long and silent. My son fell asleep in the back seat, his soft breaths the only sound in the car. I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened, but I knew I couldn't let it consume me. I had to be strong for him. He needed me more than ever. We had to rebuild. Together. It was going to be hard, but I could do it. We could do it. I wasn't alone anymore. And that gave me the strength to face whatever came next. When we finally arrived home, everything felt strangely unfamiliar. The house, once full of laughter and warmth, now felt empty. I carried my son upstairs, laying him gently in his bed, his small face peaceful in sleep. As I stood there, watching him, I felt the weight of what had happened. I thought about how everything had been ripped from me in one cruel moment. My life, my family, it was all different now. But as I looked at my son, I knew I had to keep going, for him. I couldn't let this defeat me. The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions of daily life, making meals, cleaning the house, but it all felt like I was walking through someone else's life. The weight of everything that had happened was heavy, but I couldn't afford to break down. I had to be strong. For him. My son needed me more than ever. I started to focus on the small things. His laughter, his questions, his curiosity. Every time he smiled, it gave me the strength to keep going, to keep pushing through the pain. I began to pick up the pieces of my life. Slowly, I started going back to work, reconnecting with friends. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the loneliness felt overwhelming, when the silence in the house was deafening. But I had made a choice. I was going to live. I couldn't let what had happened define me. I started finding new ways to fill the emptiness. Writing, reading, taking long walks. Little by little, I was finding myself again, and it felt good, strong, like I was becoming someone new. But just when I thought I was starting to heal, he showed up. My husband. It had been weeks since he disappeared, but here he was, standing on my doorstep, looking more broken than I had ever seen him. I didn't know how to feel. Anger? Betrayal? Sadness? It was all too much. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, staring at him. He was the last person I wanted to see, yet I couldn't turn him away. Not after everything. But I had to be careful. He had already hurt me once. We sat in the living room, an awkward silence stretching between us. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. "I made a mistake," he said quietly. "I see that now." His eyes were filled with regret, but I wasn't sure if I believed him. "I hurt you," he continued, his voice breaking. "I didn't think about you, about our son. I was selfish." I stared at him, feeling the old anger bubble up inside me. How could he have done this? How could he have torn our family apart and just expect me to forgive him? "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "You broke me. You broke us." He looked down at his hands, his face pale. "I know," he whispered, "and I'm sorry. I know it doesn't make up for anything, but I'm so sorry." His words were laced with guilt, but they felt empty. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that he was sorry. But the truth was, I didn't know if I could trust him again. He had walked away from me and our son without a second thought. "I don't know what you want from me," I said quietly. "What do you expect? For me to just take you back? To pretend like nothing happened?" His face crumpled. "No," he said softly. "I don't expect that. I just want a chance to make things right. I want to be part of our son's life again." I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. "You can't just come back into our lives like nothing happened. You can't just waltz in and expect everything to be okay." His shoulders slumped. "I know. I don't expect forgiveness. But I'm here if you'll let me try." We sat there in silence for what felt like hours. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to feel. The hurt was still so fresh, so raw. And yet, a part of me wanted to believe that he was truly sorry, that he really wanted to make things right. But how could I know? How could I trust him again after everything he had done? I had spent so many sleepless nights wondering if he'd ever come back, and now that he was here, I wasn't sure what to do with him. I told him I needed time. I wasn't ready to make any decisions. I wasn't sure if I ever would be. "I'm not asking for you to forgive me right now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to show you that I'm here, that I'm willing to do whatever it takes." I nodded, my heart torn between the desire to move forward and the fear of getting hurt again. I wanted to believe in him. I wanted our family back. But I had to be careful. I couldn't let myself fall into the same trap again. Over the next few weeks, we took small steps. He came by to see our son, but only when I allowed it. He didn't push for more. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He just showed up, doing what he could to prove that he was serious about changing. But the walls I had built around myself were high, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to let him back in. The pain of everything that had happened still lingered, and I wasn't sure if I could ever forget it. Maybe forgiveness wasn't even the right answer. I started to notice the small things, the way he would look at me with those sad eyes, the way he tried so hard to be a good father to our son, even though everything was different now. But there was still that distance between us. Something was missing. Something had broken that could never be fixed. I didn't know if it was me or him or both of us, but the spark that used to be there was gone, and I wasn't sure if I could ever get it back. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, my mind racing with thoughts of what had happened and what was yet to come, I realized something. I had spent so much time focusing on the past, on the hurt and the betrayal, that I hadn't even given myself a chance to think about the future. My son needed me, but so did I. I had to figure out who I was outside of all of this. Outside of him. Outside of the pain. It wasn't just about rebuilding my family anymore. It was about rebuilding me. I sat down with him one night after our son had gone to bed. "I've been thinking," I said quietly. "I don't know what the future holds for us, but I do know one thing. I can't keep holding on to the past." His eyes widened, and I saw hope flicker in them. "What does that mean?" he asked cautiously. "It means," I said softly, "that I'm not sure if we can ever go back to the way things were. But I need to move forward, and I need to do it on my own terms. His face fell, but he nodded slowly. I understand. The decision to move on wasn't easy. It was painful, and it was messy, but it was mine to make. I didn't have all the answers, and I didn't know what the future held. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let this define me. I wasn't going to let it destroy me. I would be stronger, for me and for my son. We had a long road ahead of us, but it was ours to walk. And somehow, in that moment, I knew that everything would be okay. I took a deep breath, looking out the window at the world beyond. It wasn't perfect. It was messy, complicated, and broken in so many ways. But it was my life, and I was going to live it. No matter what happened, I knew I could handle it. I had already survived the worst. And now, it was time to start rebuilding, not just my family, but myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. Thank you for listening to my story until now. If you like the video, please support it by subscribing and liking.